Okay, shall we start?
Yes,
All
ma'am.
right. Irene Gibson. How many of you knew her? Did you know her? I'm the new kid on the block. I came here in '76, but I actually met Irene, and because she was involved in history, and I got involved in history real early, and Irene was one of those people who know it, and you had to go and ask her questions, you know, because she knew what was going on. She was born in 1898 in Hulberton, and to Henry and Maud Gibson. When Irene was 5, the family moved to Ingleside Farm on Power Line Road. Okay? She graduated from Holly High School in 1914, and then attended Cornell University, majoring in modern languages.
She graduated early then.
Oh, you don't have half of it. Hang in there. In 1918 to 19, she taught in Martha Washington College. In 1919 to 20, she taught in Central College, Lexington, Missouri. In 1920 to 23, she became an instructor in French and Spanish at Lynchburg College, Virginia. During these years, she was coach of the women's field hockey team. In 1923, she decided to study for a master's degree at Ohio State University, where she received her degree in 1924. Irene then accepted an instructor's job at Denison University in Ohio through most of the school year, 1924 to 25. This lady never stopped.
She did sit still.
In the spring of 1925, she accepted a position as modern language editor and social studies editor with Silver Burdett Company, a publisher of textbooks, which later became a division of Time Incorporated. With this job, she lived in East Orange, New Jersey until 1937, when she moved to Manhattan. We haven't even started yet.
No.
After the fall of France in 1940, Irene tried to become more directly involved in the war effort. In May 1941, she resigned from Silver Burdett to take a job with Casey Jones School of Aeronautics in its Inter-American Program for Spanish-speaking trainees. She helped prepare AAF manuals in Spanish. In 1942, Irene enlisted and did a month of basic training in Des Moines, Iowa, after which, with other WWIIs, she returned to New York City. In early 1943, this detachment was sent to Mitchell Field, Long Island. Here she was in charge of a WWII headquarters. In November, Sergeant Gibson transferred to Gunter Field, Alabama, where French cadets were getting the same instructions as American flying cadets in the summer of 1944. Sergeant Gibson was sent to Shaw Field, South Carolina to work out a similar navigation program for other French cadets. In early 1945, she received word that she was to attend the Officers Candidate School at Fort Des Moines. In July 1945, she received a commission as second lieutenant. She received an assignment at Sheffield, Michigan, as French liaison officer, the first WWII officer in such a job. In February 1946, her request for separation from the service was granted. At this point, she took an editorial position with F.S. Crofts Company in New York City. Okay, she's been through all these things, plus the war.
In her 40s.
Yeah,
That's,
she was in her 40s
that's tough.
when she was in the military. But she came out of the military and went and got a job with a publishing company in New York City. But in the fall of 1946, learned of a pressing need for French-speaking staff at the United Nations. Took a position at the United Nations. She was offered a job at once and began work with its printing division in November of 1946. In 1948, she spent a month in Geneva, Switzerland, At the Geneva headquarters in 1956, Irene became head of the printing division, which housed in the secretarial building at 42nd Street, New York City. This lady never quit. She left the UN in 1958 to return to Holly. At that point, she was to care for her ailing mother and an invalid sister in their family home. So now she's back in Orleans County.
Yeah.
And this is where we know her from. Is back in Orleans County. She was involved in local history organizations. She wrote that book, Historic Sites in Orleans County. And we have one of these, and I have no idea if you could even find another one. But this says, My 3 Years in World War II by Irene Gibson. And she writes down what happened to her, what she did, where she went during World War II. There were things written about her and by her after she got here back into Orleans County. And I found one that was in the Suburban News from Brockport. From teaching French to teaching navigation in French. After the fall of France in 1940, she says she wanted to take a more active role in helping her country, so she decided to leave the editing profession. She took a job with the Casey Jones School of Aeronautics in its Inter-American program for Spanish-speaking trainees and helped translate aviation manuals. In 1942, she joined the newly created Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, completing basic training at the age of 44.
Good grief.
Is one of the reasons for her long, healthy life, Gibson said. I was always physically active, playing sports in college and coaching while I was teaching. But I think it helped being physical active when I was in my 40s. We sure did a lot of marching, Gibson said. As a sergeant with the WWII, she instructed French cadets in navigation. Given only 3 weeks of cramming to learn the basics of navigation, she was able to teach the cadets to read flight charts, how to use hand computers, and how to draw wind drift diagrams. She had to learn all that before she could teach somebody else.
My God.
After attending officer training school, Gibson was commissioned a second lieutenant and was appointed French liaison officer in Michigan, the first WWII officer of this job. This woman just never quit. She was always doing something. Back here, she was in this article on Senior Citizens of the Year, written in the Medina newspaper. Gibson, 89, is a native of Holly, although she spent her working years mostly in the New York City area. She returned to Holly in 1958 when her mother was ill. During her working years, she worked as an editor in several publishing houses in the New York area, including Silver Burdett Company and F.S. Crofts. At the time of her retirement, she was working at the United Nations. She had been employed there for 12 years as editor in the Bureau of Economic Affairs printing division. So she worked in the UN. She wasn't just a member. She worked. She had a job there. Gibson also served with the U.S. Women's Army Corps from 1942 to 46. During her service there, she served at Gunter Field, Alabama from 44 to 45, teaching French cadets in the ground school of flyer training. So she had to learn all the flyer training herself. So she could teach someone who only spoke French the training manuals.
That's tricky.
This lady was phenomenal.
She's great.
Yeah. They were being taught the same things as the American cadets, but did not speak English, she said. I was given a crash course in navigations, Morse code, weather map reading, and so on, and instructed the French students at the ground school. So she had to learn all those things so she could teach other people while speaking French. And at one point, Spanish also. She was fluent in both languages. There were Oh yeah, in 1929, before the war, she sailed from New York to Cadiz, Spain, and spent a month in Paris, returning by way of London and Southampton to New York. Pretty adventurous for a single woman at that time, which is true. She was a going unit from the minute she was born. In 1938, there was an article in the paper about her. It says, former Holly girl praised as versatile and capable. This was from the editor of Silver Burdett Company in New York City to Mr. Williamson of, this was to Mr. Williamson, editor of Silver Burdett, from Westcott and Thompson Incorporated, sales manager of the book department. In my experience, I have never met so versatile as your Miss Irene M. Gibson. You are indeed fortunate to have in your organization such a capable person. Some people can plan a book, but very few can give the painstaking care to a job that your world history is getting right now from Miss Gibson, who is doing the work that is usually headed by 3 persons, a proofreader, an editor, and a production detail worker. Considering the nature of the work, Miss Gibson is doing a very remarkable job. If she were doing any one of the 3 persons' work, she would still be doing a remarkable job. Nothing seems to escape her attention. And then proofreading is exceptionally well covered. Your whole concern is really one of the most efficient in the industry. Again, thanking you for your business. So that letter was sent to her from her employer, praising her to other people. This was in Holly Standard 1944. Instructor at Gunter Field awarded Good Conduct Medal. Sergeant Irene M. Gibson, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Henry J. Gibson, has been awarded the Good Conduct Medal. It was announced by Colonel Raymond L. Wynn, commanding officer at Gunter Field, Montgomery, Alabama. Sergeant Gibson joined the Army Air Forces in September 1942, and her present duty is in the ground school where she helps to instruct navigation to French cadets. Gunter Field is a major station in the AAF Training Command. In 1946, Irene M. Gibson has been discharged as a WWII lieutenant from the AAF and has accepted a position with the F.S. Crofts and Company of New York City, publishers of college textbooks. And let's see. This one is October 31st, 1946. Miss Gibson, editor at UN Secretariat. Miss Irene M. Gibson of New York City has been visiting her mother, Mrs. H.J. Gibson, at 19 South Main Street, Holly, prior to beginning editorial work in the publication department of the United Nations Secretariat at Lake Success, Long Island. Since becoming a civilian in February 1946, she's been an editor at the F.S. Crofts and Company in New York City. So just a few of the articles that were in the paper. This one, I just want to read you the quote. My life has not exactly been dull.
Really?
Says the new author in an understatement. I've lived in many places. In World War II, I had the changes of station. In fact, and have been privileged to work with French cadets, inter-American exchange students, and citizens of other countries at the United Nations, and to live in the nicest county in Western New York. She was very pro-Orleans County. In 1979, was in the paper, author will be honored. A reception will be held Sunday from 2 to 4 at the historic chapter house of the Orleans chapter, Daughter of American Revolution, 423 North Main Street, to introduce the public to the author of the new book, Historic Sites in Orleans County, New York, Miss Irene Gibson and others responsible for this publication. So still in 1979, this lady that was born in 1898.
Plus she taught school back in Holland.
Yeah, she taught school for a while, yeah, when she came back to take care of her mother.
Holy moly.
Yeah. So in 1979, this lady's still going strong, has authored that book, and attended a celebration for her because of that book. This lady was phenomenal. Like I said, I knew her to talk to her, didn't realize 1/10 of what she'd done with her life. But this, I don't have one that circulates. If somebody is really hot on Irene, I can make copies of this one, because I had to make a copy for myself. Because it says everything in her own words.
Sure.
And my 3 years in World War II. And she writes, I'll just read you a few entries. In the year 1941, I was sufficiently concerned about the progress of the war in Europe, particularly the defeat of France, to want to get into the war work in the United States. At this point, she's 43 years old. I left my job as editor of Silver Burdette Company, publishers of textbooks, and tried to find a job in a company engaged in defense production. First, I applied at the Sperry Gyroscope Company, then at a parachute company. In each instance, I was given an interview, but told that I was overqualified for a job on the assembly line. Only about 6 months later, these companies were taking on every woman they could get hold of, whether overqualified or not, but I was just a little ahead of the rush. Because once the war became a reality, they didn't care what situation you were in. They needed the hands to produce things. Discouraged by these rejections, I decided to do volunteer war work and went to the headquarters of the voluntary services in New York City. At the time, I was living on East 18th Street in Manhattan. The lady who talked with me at the voluntary services mentioned a number of opportunities, among them the aircraft warning service. Already, I was an air warden in my block in Manhattan.
She was a plane spotter.
This job consisted of being ready to take a specified post when any siren announced an air raid. My far from fancy post was on the tin roof of the building where I lived. So she was a watcher from the time she lived in Manhattan. And she goes on and says, by now I have forgotten some of the details, but at the center I was asked if I knew how to read a map, which I did, and I was trained to be a filterer. That meant that the person doing my job was to filter out the bad reports and try to make sense out of what reports came in, so as to put down on a big map arrows that indicated the line of flight of any aircraft in the vicinity. So while she's a warden, air raid warden, she's also doing these maps. In the summer of 1942, the first contingent of women went to Fort Des Moines for training. That very first company was destined to provide officers. They weren't taking any people as enlisted WACs until after that first company was trained. But they asked many of us volunteers if we wanted to enlist. Now for several months I had been working at the center, and I knew I could do the work. I also knew it would be easier if I didn't have two jobs. Therefore, I was open to conviction, so to speak. They assured us that we would have rations and quarters, as the Army says. In other words, we could live at home and would get an allowance toward living expenses and eating expenses. This seemed to be one way in which I could help the war effort, and I therefore enlisted. This I did in September of 1942. Of course, I wondered if I'd pass the physical because I was in my 40s then, older than the average enlistee. But I did pass the physical and was sent out to Fort Des Moines, Iowa, arriving with a group from New York City and New Jersey on Columbus Day, 1942. October was hot that year, but we found it interesting because most of us It was quite novel to be in a company or a platoon and be marched here and there. The very first days we were put through the commissary to obtain clothing. So they had to find clothing that was appropriate for the women, because the women were still wearing dresses at that point. And you had to have something appropriate to wear in the military. And if you watch the old movie, you see they wore dresses. The basic training lasted for 4 weeks. I don't know how I would have managed if it had lasted several months, but in November we were sent back to New York. Long about December 1942, we were told that we would all have to give up our quarters and go to live in the Collingswood Hotel, which had been taken over as a sort of barracks. So the women went from living where they could find a place to being formally put together and moved to a barracks. During the early months of 43, a rumor went around that we were not going to work at the Aircraft Warning Center anymore, but we were going out to Mitchell Field on Long Island. At Mitchell Field, the Air Force had 1st Fighter Command headquarters and also 1st Air Force headquarters. Mitchell Field was one of the older bases. It had a number of nice brick barracks and quarters. The rumor proved to be true, and in March, we were sent out to Mitchell Field, if my memory serves me, in March of 1943. As I've said, the supply office, A4, did not deal with clothing, but with airplanes, guns that go on airplanes, radios, and other equipment for airplanes. So it wasn't a clothing outfit. It was a military provision for airplanes. At Mitchell Field, they saw to it that fighter squadrons were equipped and ready to go into action. There were several officers at headquarters. There was, for instance, a Captain Bell, who had seen service in the Pacific already. He was recovering from an attack of malaria and still looked a bit yellow from taking medicine from quinine. The lieutenant colonel who was in charge of our office, I learned shortly, was soon going to take a group into the fighting area. His group was being put together and will be ready to go in a few months. A master sergeant attached to this lieutenant colonel's outfit was nominally in charge of our office, and he picked me as his deputy. I was by that time a sergeant. He picked me to be under him, so to speak, and then he put others in various jobs. So she was picked as his next in line. So she must have proven herself to the men also. For myself, I passed the mail around to different desks and saw to it that any new Army regulations were put into the books, the loose-leaf books kept for that purpose. I was qualified to handle documents, that is, to take a document from one office to another, all the way up to just under top secret. In other words, I could handle secret documents, but not top secret. I could handle classified documents, and so on. So she helped with specific military items. Well, I do remember the first time I came back from basic training, which in my case was only 4 weeks at Fort Des Moines, as I've said. For my editor friends got together and invited me one evening to join something like 6 or 8 of them in a friend's apartment. So she does have a little bit of easy time, little party time. Excuse me. After about 6 months at Mitchell Field, I became a little disillusioned. Those 6 months I had spent learning a lot of the ropes. Among other things, one of my jobs, or at least one of the jobs that I took on myself, was to file Army regulations. New regulations came out every week, it seemed. We had a loose-leaf bound ledger-type notebook in which these were filed. Of course, when a new regulation came, it superseded the previous one. It said in its first paragraph, "This supersedes so-and-so." The old one was thrown away and the new one put in. So she had to keep up with the new regulations. After that, my duties seemed to be very few. I continued to file Army regulations and did some other minor jobs, but I felt it was wasting my time. Meanwhile, I saw in the newspapers ads for people who could speak Spanish and who could speak French. Or the ads would say, wanted people who can speak French, contact such and such headquarters. I made inquiries about this. Well, I thought, my goodness, here I specialize in French. I majored in French, and even have a master's degree in French. And by that time, had also done considerable work towards my PhD at Columbia University by taking courses. Working again in French ought to be interesting. However, I wrote a letter in my best Army language stating that here I had so many credits in French and had even taught French in college and would like to be in the program, but here I was stuck in an office doing very little more than filing. In less time than it takes me to tell it, my letter came back. It had stamped on it here and there, from this office to that office, to return through channels. The personnel officer was the one who brought it to me, and she was very put out about it because her superior had to look into the matter, and the next higher officer had to look into the matter, and they all returned my letter to the Adjutant General's office with recommendations that I be transferred into this cadet training program. To be sure, the WWII captain who was in charge of our company called me and in effect gave me a scolding for doing this directly instead of through channels. However, she had to admit that I had gotten results much faster by doing it this way. And to make the story short, I was transferred out in November of 1943, still ranked as a sergeant, and my destination was Gunter Field, Alabama. So she took it upon herself to submit her papers, not going to the line of...
Nobody got time for that.
No, so she didn't have time for that. She wanted to get them to get yes or no. Yeah. Gunter Field was flying training base at that time, not far from Maxwell Air Force Field. The head of the base said, well, we've heard about you. I see from your record, he had my college records no less, that you've had solid geometry and trigonometry training. I replied, yes, sir, I had those my first year at Cornell. He asked, how are you at map reading? I admitted that in my work as social studies editor for Silver Burdette Company, I had handled several books, histories and social studies books, that had maps, so I knew something about maps and how to get them published. In the end, he asked, do you think you could learn enough about navigation in, say, 3 weeks to teach navigation in French?
No pressure.
No pressure at all, but I think she's up to it.
Yeah.
You can imagine I was just a little set back by that. I was at first thinking of celestial navigation, but he hastened to explain that this didn't involve celestial navigation, which would take a long time to become expert in, but merely navigation needed at the stage where the cadets were in their flying, when they did their first cross-country flights. For these, they had to be able to read a chart, plot a course, figure out ETA, estimated time of arrival, for 2 or 3 checkpoints, and study the terrain along their line of flight. So she started studying these charts and things that she had to explain in another language. And she said, I also visited and listened to the classes where an instructor was instructing French cadets. So she went to the training classes in other subjects to understand how that professor was teaching those French candidates. Each squadron was a highly motivated group of young men. I never had any difficulties holding their attention. Once they saw that I knew what I was talking about, and they understood the need for knowledge of navigation and realized I expected them to master every single stage of the course, they paid close attention. So she won over the young men. After the first 2 weeks of watching what the instructors did, both in classes for American cadets and in classes for French cadets, I really was pretty well adjusted to the idea of what I was going to do. Meanwhile, the instructor whom I was to replace was getting restive and impatient. He would ask, couldn't Sergeant Gibson take the class this morning? Or all the classes this morning, and I took them. Then the next day, couldn't Sergeant Gibson take all of the afternoon classes so I'd get in more flying time? Consequently, the 3rd week I was actually teaching. Then they let him go. He went into active service right off. So now she's teaching. So then I was on my own. But by then I was pretty well orientated and classes went reasonably smoothly. The young cadets knew that I wanted them to get everything they were supposed to get. They knew it was important that they should get the necessary skills, otherwise they wouldn't pass the courses and they'd be washed out. They'd have to do something else. They wouldn't actually be dismissed from the Army, but they'd have to take some job, let's say as a gunner. They might be a bomber, but wouldn't become a pilot. They'd be taught gunnery or taught some other specialty. So you had to decide what was your goal. At the close of 3 months at Officer Candidate School, we had been given assignments, and as you can imagine, that day was one of great excitement. We were awarded our gold bars, which are pinned on our officer's shoulder, which showed that each of us was a second lieutenant. Over the 3 months, we've been accumulating an outfitted uniform, but we couldn't buy very many until we knew our assignment. One WWII officer might get sent to Alaska, let's say, or to the Aleutian Islands, and somebody else to the South Pacific. Thus, you didn't know how many uniforms to have of one type or another. Nevertheless, we purchased a basic supply. So you had to purchase your uniforms before you knew which way you were going. Were you going to the hot countries or the cold countries? While I was at Mitchell Field, about 10 days, I was told that the officers in the 1st Air Force were trying to replace me at Selfridge Field as the French liaison officer. This was not said to me officially, but news gets around, and some people are better at ferreting out news than others. So from someone I found out that I was probably going to Selfridge. No WWII officer had had a position as French liaison officer before, so it was sort of a first. I learned later, as the war was winding down, that one of the lieutenants who had been in charge of our company at Fort Des Moines when I was in basic back in 1942 had somehow kept an interest in me and kept track of my changes in station. When I was at Gunter Field, she was also at one of the southern states. She was certain by then. Her name was Grote, and she was a couple of other WWII officers had come some months before to inspect the WWII detachment there at Gunter Field and had learned that I was instructing navigation in French. Then she goes on and says, then I handed out exercise sheets to the cadets and went down from the lecture platform, walking around asking questions and finding out who needed help. And apparently that had struck them favorably, and they said to one another, if Sergeant Gibson is this good in French, she could be a French liaison officer. Now a French liaison officer is responsible for interpreting between French cadets or officers and Americans. I had an office, had a secretary who was a French-speaking sergeant, and had about 30 GIs in my charge. Oh my gosh. This woman just keeps climbing. Wherever she is, she goes up in importance and job-wise. People notice her, but she also fights for the position. She also doesn't want to turn anything down. Well, this is the part that I enjoyed in this idea about her life and what happened with her. One of the most interesting things that happened to me during this period in 1945 was the inspection visit of General Charles De Gaulle. General De Gaulle had been persuaded during the time when the Allies were helping to get a government going in France and get the Allied forces out of the French territory. He'd been persuaded to come over and see for himself the bases, which were French cadets and French pilots and French navigators, were getting their instruction. Naturally, the Army Air Force bases had to do everything properly. The French are great sticklers for doing things the proper way, and some of our high brass were equally great sticklers, so the people at Selfridge Field were a bit jittery. This was one of the main flying fields. Of course, still, it was nothing like a headquarters field, such as Mitchellfield. As I said, everything had to be exactly correct. On the day in question, the French squadrons were drawn to the ranks, and spit and polish was obvious all over the place. A number of American squadrons were drawn up nearby, and the ramp was, I would say, decorated, but fixed up with flags and other accoutrements. As the plane came in and we could see it approaching, I realized that there was a radio man standing nearby. When I say nearby, I mean near Colonel Shaw and some of the top American officers, who were prepared to welcome the incoming generals. This reporter had taken up his stand near our group and was broadcasting to Detroit, to one of the Detroit stations, on the whole affair. He was saying, "Here comes the plane, we can see it in the distance. It's circling the field and now it's coming down." Presently, the steps were hauled to the plane and General De Gaulle was coming down. The reporter went on. "General so-and-so is with him and Colonel so-and-so." He gave a list of the officers that he had already acquired from our headquarters. He went on describing the event while, of course, my attention was chiefly on Colonel Shaw. I was standing about 2 paces behind him in case he needed help. With General de Gaulle was an Army Air Force general of equal rank. All the protocol was in a way taken out of our hands by the higher-ups. The visiting officers came along and there was a brief inspection ceremony. This was customary in the circumstances. And then the U.S. officers drew up on one side. The General de Gaulle, who was a very tall fellow, I think 6 feet 5 inches at any rate, he stood out. And he had the kind of face you couldn't forget. Beckoned to the French squadrons to break ranks and come over around him, which they did. By chance, later that day, I was in the BOQ, that's the Bachelor Officers' Quarters, where they were having a mixed cocktail party, both French and American officers. Everybody, including the WWII officers on the field, were there, including myself, and I heard the 6 o'clock news coming over from the Detroit station. De Gaulle's visit was being described. I heard the radio man say that Lieutenant Irene Gibson will tell us what de Gaulle said. And then I heard myself saying it. I was pleased to see that my voice was clear and I really delivered my part as well as the reporter had done his. She was standing behind de Gaulle when somebody asked him a question, and the people around him didn't quite understand. So Irene stood up and said to him, "They're asking you, sir, so-and-so and so-and-so and so." She ended up on the radio with her name being said as a translator for Charles De Gaulle.
Wow.
I think this woman, it was amazing. I knew her, but I didn't know her. I knew her as, "Hi, Irene, how you doing?" That kind of no. But to think this woman had accomplished all this, and she had the last of this write-up. She says, "By January 1946, nearly all the French cadets and officers had left Air Force bases, and I was able to leave Selfridge Field for Fort Dix Separation Center. By February 1946, I was starting my new job in publishing." So that's what I know about Irene Gibson. And she was a native of Orleans County. After she did a few things, she came back to Orleans County and lived here until she passed away.
I think she wrote a genealogy of what family?
Yeah.
Darrow?
Yes, because she was related to them.
Yeah.
They were
And
ancestors.
the Bartletts, Darrows, Gibsons,
Yeah.
Warrens, they were all
related. Yeah, yeah. So I hope you learned a little bit about Irene. I did when I researched her. I was flabbergasted when I found this, and she donated it to the local history files, and her signature is at the top.
That's awesome.
So thanks for listening.
Thank you.
No, she sounded amazing. We need a plaque in front of her.